Okay, so getting started with what we're talking about today. So for today we read Feinberg's piece on offensiveness, and this is a bit more general, applies to things more generally than just speech and expression, but I thought it would be useful because it does have a lot of elements that are relevant to that debate. So he starts off by giving us what he calls the offense principle, and we're supposed to contrast this, of course, with the harm principle from Mill. And the offense principle says this: "It is always a good reason in support of a proposed criminal prohibition that it would probably be an effective way of preventing serious offense, as opposed to injury or harm," right? So offense, not injury or harm, to persons other than the actor, and that it is probably a necessary means to that end. So, to rephrase that, the idea is that you always have a good reason to prohibit something wherein someone offends someone else. And the limitation on that, one of the limitations on that, is that it has to be that your prohibition is likely to be effective, and that it's likely to be the only way of achieving the end of preventing that offense. Now, it doesn't have to be the only way, it might just be the least expensive way in terms of other values that are relevant, but that's the sort of broad idea of it. So it's similar in many ways then to the harm principle, as you can see, just applied to offense rather than harm. Feinberg also makes the point right near the beginning that we need to make sure that we're clear on what kind of offense we're talking about, and he means to only talk about wrongful offense. So only the offense which is done in a way which is wrongful or rights violating counts as an offense of the sort that the offense principle is talking about. So there might be many ways of offending people without wronging them, without violating any of their rights, and those sort of cases are not the ones that Feinberg has in mind. He also gives us a little idea of what exactly he means by offense, and broadly, offense is the creation of a negative mental state, like disgust, shame, hurt, anxiety, and so on. And we'll see later a broader range of examples and categorizations of kinds of offense that you might give to someone. Feinberg says at one point, see, you might rightly think that Feinberg's limitation of the offense principle to only wrongful offense doesn't make it very clear at what sort of thing he's talking about. He later says that offense is wrongful whenever it is produced in another without justification or excuse. Now, there's still a lot to unpack there. When do you count as having justification? When do you count as having excuse? And that's something that we would have to look at particular cases in more depth to say much about. But that's a sort of baseline that you can think about when thinking about what is wrongful offense, as opposed to just offense generally. Now, this next point Feinberg thinks is very important, and that's that offense is less serious than harm, and so it should be treated that way by the law. Offenders, people who offend others, should not be punished significantly, if at all. Typically, injunctions, which is a legal order to not do something, or to do something, and fines should be the extent of the deterrents, the legal mechanisms that are used. And generally, he thinks that this can be left outside of the criminal law and mostly just in the civil law, where people can bring suits against those who have specifically offended them. Only in cases where someone is doing something offensive to the public at large do we need to bring in the criminal law, according to Feinberg. So, he goes on to analyze offense as a sort of nuisance, and so he has a significant discussion of nuisance law and how that works, which is important for understanding his position on how potential laws against offending others might work. And there are, you could count them differently, but I'm counting it as 6 different factors that you'd want to consider when you're, if you were to be judging a case of offense. And so the first factor you'd want to look at is the extent, the duration, and the character of the offense. So how long does the offense go on? How offensive is it, in fact? What sort of offense is being given? Those are things to consider. We also want to consider the extent to which the offense is avoidable by the person who's offended. How easy is it for them to take themselves out of the situation where they are being offended? We want to look at the motive of the offender. Are they doing it just for the purpose of offending someone, or do they have some more important purpose which incidentally offends other people? We want to also look at the extent to which the offender can achieve their goals reasonably without offending the people that they are offending, without causing any offense. Right? The more avoidable it is, obviously, the more serious the offense is, since they could have avoided doing it. Then we want to look at the social values of both the thing that is causing the offense and the thing that the offended person is doing, or the states that they have, which we might put some sort of value on protecting. And then finally, we want to look at the interest of the community or the public at large. And so the offense principle, Feinberg says, should ultimately be mediated through a balancing of these factors. So we can look back at Mill's harm principle, and he doesn't explicitly go through this sort of process, but remember that his harm principle only says that harm is a possible justification. When you're harming someone else, that's a possible justification of interference with someone's liberty, with the person who's doing the harming in particular. But there are cases where you might harm someone, and yet we don't have a reason to prevent you from doing that, right? So Mill admits of those cases, and he might have something like these mediating factors in mind. And also, of course, he's also got in mind the distinction between a wrongful harm and a non-wrongful harm. So, again, this is just something that you need to be thinking about if you're thinking about how you would judge a case, or how you would create policy which prohibited certain sorts of offensive acts, according to Feinberg. So, what I think is the most interesting part of this article is where Feinberg goes through a number of different short stories, where he asks you to consider your reaction to a number of cases where someone is doing something that would likely be very offensive, or at least somewhat offensive, on a crowded bus, where leaving the bus is an option for you, but it's an expensive option. Not in the sense that the bus fare is particularly expensive, although that is a cost that you would have to bear, but in that you're taking this bus to go somewhere important, to work, to and some sort of appointment that you have, which it would be difficult to reschedule. Right, so there is some significant cost to you just leaving the situation. And he goes through a number of these stories. I can't remember the exact number. It's about 30, but they're all very short. And then at the end, he analyzes these down to 6 different categories of offense that someone might give. And so I'll just run through these categories quickly and summarize the main idea behind putting them in these categories. So the first category is an affront to the senses. And these are cases where the unpleasant experience, the offense, derives entirely from sound, color, or odor, and not at all from some sort of symbolism or moral principle that you might have. Right? So these are the cases where just your senses, just your base level senses, are really being offended, and not your sensibilities. The second group, disgust and revulsion, this is a case where it is where the offense is mediated through recognition or belief, through your sensibilities. The cases where people are eating strange things, vomiting them, and then eating their vomit, it has less to do with the colors, the shape, the sounds, and even the smells of what they've got there. And it has a lot more to do with the ideas behind those things that they're eating, your recognition of what those things are that they're eating, that you're smelling, and so on. So it's an affront to the sensibilities and not just the senses, although the senses are involved. The third group is affronts to your moral, religious, or patriotic sensibilities. And these are different because they require mediation through higher level thinking. Not just our basic revulsion to eating certain things or smelling certain things. It requires a use of our rational capacities. We're making moral judgments, or we're considering religious principles or patriotic principles. In these cases, you can see that they're quite different from the lower level disgust and revulsion. Not necessarily more serious, but different in kind. The fourth sort of case that he considers are violations of cultural and specifically sexual taboos. So Feinberg's thought here is that this is distinct from the previous groups in that the unpleasant feelings come in large part because of shame that we feel in ourselves when considering such acts. So he has a number, he talks about this at some length, what the reason that we might feel shame is, what the causes might be. And I'll leave that to you to read. The fifth category is boredom, which generally might be characterized as commanding your attention and preventing you from more enjoyable activities. Right? So we all know the sense of boredom, but he wants not just boredom in the sense of we don't feel like we have anything to do, but rather that someone else who is themselves boring, who is a bore, is commanding our attention and preventing us from going on with more enjoyable activities that we might have. And finally, the sixth category is a kind of contemptuous mockery or baiting of other people. And these are instances where what someone is doing or the images or messages they're displaying cause flares of emotion in us that are difficult to control due to the directness of the offense against you in particular, generally. So, in these sort of cases, they're different from the cases of moral or religious or patriotic sensibilities being violated, because those are typically Feinberg is thinking those are less directed. They don't cause these flares of emotions as much. So in some cases they do. Certainly, I've seen people who react very strongly and immediately to people disrespecting the flag, for instance. So it's certainly possible that some of these categories can overlap in certain cases. So the general principle that's behind all of these kind of cases and behind offense more generally is that these offenses, as Feinberg says, make it difficult for one to enjoy one's work or leisure in a place that you can't be reasonably expected to leave, given the circumstances. Right? So like the bus, where you're on your way to an appointment. And then in extreme cases, the offending conduct not only does that, but it commandeers your attention. it forces you to relinquish control over your inner state, over your emotions. Drop what you're doing in order to either cope or just experience these emotions when it's inconvenient for you to do so. So Feinberg then goes on to discuss how these sorts of acts, and offensive acts generally, might violate our right to privacy. And he follows another author, Beardsley, in dividing the right to privacy into two parts: the right to autonomy on the one hand and the right to selective disclosure on the other. And all of these cases, all of these offenses, are going to be potential violations of the right to autonomy. The right to determine for yourself whether or not to perform an act or undergo some sort of experience. And so, going back then to the earlier distinction between wrongful or rights-violating offenses and non-rights-violating offenses, this is the sort of right that Feinberg thinks is the most plausible candidate for the right that might be violated in the offense case. So these are things to consider. You should certainly read through Feinberg. There's a lot that I didn't cover in this lecture, but I wanted to give a sort of broad overview of the general concepts. So we've got, it looks like, a few people watching now, so if you have any questions, I will wait for them and see what I can answer. While we're waiting, I will say something about the exam. Oh, I guess I could also tell you some of the results of the quiz at this point, the entrance quiz. So, as far as the exam goes, a few people seem to have had some technical problems, but otherwise it seems to have gone okay. I haven't looked at them yet. I expect to have them all graded by the end of tomorrow. Not necessarily before my lecture, but sometime before the end of tomorrow. And I will get back to you. It's a very similar format to the previous one. So those of you who are watching can feel totally free to jump in with questions at any time, but I'm going to just quickly, for the sake of interest, go through the results of the entrance quiz for this module. So the first question was asking, speech or expression which is deeply offensive to some can be rightly regulated to prevent people from causing others emotional distress. And 44% of you said that that is true, that it is permissible for such speech or expression to be regulated, while the remaining 56% of you disagreed and thought that that was not appropriate. And so we'll see a case on this issue in particular that was decided by the Supreme Court just recently, in fact, when we read Snyder versus Phelps. Question 2. People should have a legal right to publicly or privately express their opinion on any political issue, including advocating that others break the law. And 61% of you said that that is true, while the remaining 39% think that that is false. Okay, I'm going to... yeah, so this is another thing that the Supreme Court has a case on that we'll be reading, which is Schneck versus USA. The third question was, people ought to have a legal right to say whatever they want when they are doing so in their own homes and businesses, even if it is hateful, bigoted, or disgusting. And 70% of you said yes to that, while the remaining 30% said no. And question 4, People should have a right to freely express themselves not only by speaking or writing, but also through other expressive acts like wearing certain clothing, spending their money supporting companies and organizations they agree with, and so on. 87% of you said yes, and only 13% said no, interestingly. If we had read Citizens United versus the FEC, we would have seen a case on that issue. So interesting. All right, so we have a question from the audience here, which asks, would Mill agree with Feinberg's 6 categories causing harm? Okay, so this is an important question. So Feinberg doesn't think that these 6 categories are categories of harm. They're categories of offense, and offense is not the same as harm for Feinberg, and it wouldn't be the same for Mill either. Mill thinks that mere offense is not sufficient to allow the interference with liberty. Feinberg thinks that it is, but if you look at the harm principle does not allow mere offense to count as something which causes harm, right, and can be rightly regulated or prohibited on those grounds. Feinberg is adding on an additional principle, the offense principle, particularly because the harm principle cannot cover cases like those 6 categories that we talked about. Okay, so feel free to ask more about that if that wasn't clear. So you have another question here, which is great. You ask, Sammy asks here, can you explain what Feinberg and Mill would say about question 4? So question 4, again, is people should have a right to freely express themselves not only by speaking or writing, but also through other expressive acts like wearing certain clothing, spending their money supporting companies and organizations they agree with, and so on. So what would Mill and Feinberg say? It's hard to know exactly, at least from what we've read. They don't talk much about that issue in particular. I imagine that Mill, on the basis of the harm principle at least, would say that it's fine for people to express themselves in those ways too. I'm not sure if he would make any limitations for things like donating to political campaigns. It's not clear to me whether he would or not. I wouldn't think that he would, but it's hard to say without knowing a lot more about Mill than I happen to. Feinberg, I think Feinberg, we've seen already in this piece that Feinberg thinks that it's legitimate for there to be some regulation of speech in general, and also things like wearing certain clothing and so on. Oh, okay. A different question was meant. So let me just finish this. Yeah. So Feinberg allows for some regulations on all of these things, on all expressive acts, including those which aren't speech. I assume that he thinks that they should be treated similarly, but again, I've not seen him write on issues like campaign finance. Okay, so the question that Sammy wanted an answer to instead was people ought to have a legal right to say whatever they want when doing so in their own homes and businesses, even if it's hateful, bigoted, or disgusting. Okay, I think Mill is quite likely to think that that's true, in particular because it doesn't seem likely that that would violate the harm principle. Now, Mill does say at some point that a possible limitation on the harm principle would be the public expression of certain views which might be bigoted or possibly disgusting. It's a difficult thing to figure out with Mill exactly how far he thinks the harm principle would go. Feinberg, I think, is going to tend to say that in your home as long as these statements are private and don't escape your home, it's going to be permissible, and Mill would say that too. But Feinberg would certainly say that in a business which is open to the public, you could be causing offense to other people, and so it might rightly be permissible to regulate your hateful, bigoted, or disgusting speech or expression. Does that make sense? Wait for a response. Okay, great. Yeah, so I'll wait to see if there are any other questions. It looks like there are 2 people watching right now, and I've gotten questions only from Sammy. So if the other person has any questions, or if Sammy, you think of any more questions, I'd be happy to answer some more while I'm here. Okay, I guess it looks like there is nothing else for now. So if you have more questions, you can, or maybe it's that my stream is not doing well right now. Nope. Okay. Yeah, so if you have any more questions, always feel free to post on the D2L forums or email me, and I'd be happy to answer. So I will talk to you tomorrow.